Hi, I'm Mike Scantlebury. I write a lot of books. This is one of them. I find that some people like these books. They're crime fiction thrillers, they're adventure stories, they're mysteries, they're whodunits. They're a combination of things, and they're all set in northwest England, even though some of the characters have come in from abroad. And people have opinions about these books, whether they like them or not. And some people write reviews. And I like to read reviews because I find that they might sometimes be helpful in making me think about what I've written in the past and what I might write in the future. However, what I also find is that a lot of reviewers don't really think about the reviews they write. It's almost as though they just grab hold of their keyboard and start tapping away, and sometimes the reviews make no sense because obviously they haven't thought it through. And people will say things like, well, I quite like it, but there's a problem with it, and on the other hand it's not so bad, and then they end up giving me 3 stars out of 5, which is right down the middle, and means it's a little bit good, it's a little bit bad. That's not very helpful. Most reviewers don't realise, it seems to me, that there are 3 levels of review, and they need to think about that before they ever get round to typing something out. The first level of criticism is what you might call the informational stage. Now at this point it's about saying things like, this is a book by Mike Scantlebury, it's a book about the election of a mayor in Salford in 2016. There were a lot of candidates for that election, and the book describes some of them and what happened to them, but it's also a fictional account, and there's a lot of adventures that didn't actually happen in real life. And in this book, some of the terrible things that happened is that Mickey gets kidnapped, for instance. So that's complete fiction, but it's very exciting, and it leads Melia to have to appeal to the chief of police to actually help get Mickey rescued. Very exciting. Now, saying those things, it's simply giving you information. It's telling you there is a book, it's telling you who it's by, it's telling you where it's set and what happens. So the big problem with information is most people don't want spoilers. They might want to know that Mickey, who's a hero, does get rescued, but perhaps they don't want to know who by and how it comes about and whether it all ends happily and if anybody's injured along the way, whether any of Mickey or Melia's colleagues gets hurt during the course of this adventure. So that's one thing to watch out for. You don't necessarily reveal the ending. If it's a murder mystery, don't actually say who did it because that spoils it for everybody else. But if you're simply giving that information, saying that that book's available, people can find it if they look on Amazon or whether one of the other online bookshops, the bookshops are available, then that's simply level 1. That's simply telling you about the fact that there's a book out, somebody's written it, and you can obtain it now. And it's giving you an idea, because if you don't like murder mysteries, avoid it. If you don't like adventure stories, if you don't like people running around, then that's perfect for you. But when people say that, what it allows is the reader of the review to make up their own mind. Because they can say, an adventure story, I like the sound of that, and they might decide to buy it. They might say, an adventure story, I've had enough of those, and they might decide not to look at it. But the reader decides that. It's not the reviewer telling anybody what to do. The second level of criticism is where the reviewer gives an opinion. And that's fine. Everybody's entitled to say, here's a book, I like it. They might say, here's a book, I didn't enjoy it at all. And that's their opinion. And as long as they say that, as long as they say, in my opinion, I didn't really like it, it was too complicated, it was a story about terrorists, but also there was Melia's cousin Liv, and she was worried about a friend of hers who'd been sent to prison. It all got so complicated, I didn't like that. Now, if they say quite clearly that that is their opinion, I don't have a problem with that at all, because I think every reader is entitled to make up their own mind. However, if people say things like, this isn't a very good book, now you might think, well, that's their opinion, but they haven't said that, have they? They haven't said, in my opinion, it's not a very good book. What they've said is, it isn't a very good book. And the trouble with that is that it's catchy. If you hear somebody who says, I read that book, it's not very good, you know, then you might think, oh dear, by some standards that we all understand, perhaps the dialogue wasn't very interesting, perhaps the plot was a bit confused. But notice, the person hasn't said that. If they say, I found this book confusing, that's completely different from saying, this is a very confusing book. If they said, some of the characters in this book are very unappealing, that makes it sound as though it's a fact. If they said, I couldn't really get on with these characters, I found them very unappealing, then that's their opinion. And the trouble with some reviewers is because they're just dashing down their thoughts, that they say the first thing that comes into their heads. They don't go back and look at what they've written. They don't go back and look at the fact that it says in print, this is not a good book. And they don't look at that and think, oh, well, actually, that's my opinion. Maybe I should say that. Maybe I should say, in my opinion, I didn't like it. It wasn't a good book. It wasn't very well written. The dialogue was a bit boring. Some of the characters weren't very exciting. If they could just add the fact that they were giving their opinion, or if they could make it clear that it was their opinion, then again, what the reader of the review can do is make up their own mind. Because somebody might say, I didn't like this book, but then I don't really like adventure stories. Okay, the reader might say, I agree with you. Or they might say, well, I like adventure stories, in which case they would enjoy the book. So give them a chance to buy it. That's a clear difference between people stating good, bad, and people saying, in my opinion, it's very good. In my opinion, it's not so good. There's a difference between so-called fact and opinions. The third level of criticism is sometimes even more difficult to spot. It's what I call the call to action. And sometimes it's obvious when people say, this is the best book I've read all year. Now, you might think, well, that's just an opinion. But what they're actually saying is, I really enjoyed reading this book, and you will too. You should rush out and buy it. They haven't said that. Sometimes they do say that. They'll say things like, if you're going to buy a murder mystery this year, then make sure you get Poison Doctor by Mike Scantlebury. Make sure it's on your shopping list. Or they might say something like, this is the ideal book to give to your auntie for Christmas. And that's what I call a call to action, because that's saying to you, the reader, there's something you must do. They're saying, I've read this book, you should too. They're saying, I bought a book and I'll tell you all about it, and when I've finished, you'll be so convinced by what I've said, you'll rush out and buy it. Sometimes the only time you notice is when it's the opposite. When they say things like, well, that was a complete waste of money. And what they're saying there is, I wasted my money on the book, don't you do it. That's telling you to do something, isn't it? Sometimes it's disguised, sometimes it's absolutely obvious, because that's what they're telling you. Now, if somebody said to you, don't buy this book, you might think, well, who are they to tell me what to do? I'll make up my own mind. And that's your opinion. But sometimes, because the thing is disguised, I mean, one example was, a few years ago, somebody bought one of my ebooks, and it was on special offer, so it was 99 cents. You could buy this book for a week for 99 cents. And somebody wrote a review of this book and said they didn't enjoy it at all. And they said, that's 99 cents I'll never see again. And they didn't seem to realise that made them look a bit cheap, didn't it? Because 99 cents isn't even the price of a cup of coffee. And yet they regretted the fact that they'd spent that amount of money. But quite clearly, what they were saying was, don't make the mistake I made, save your 99 cents and don't buy this book. And that's an opinion disguised as a command. And readers need to be on their guard against that. Sometimes they see it, sometimes they don't. But it seems to me that that third level of criticism is completely unjustified unless you actually explain that that's what you mean. Unless you're saying, I wasted my money and I urge everybody else not to do the same. And then let people make up their own minds. But if you're simply telling people, this is an awful book, it's a complete waste of paper, then you're disguising the fact that you're trying to dissuade them and persuade them not to buy it simply by your opinion. That's the third level of criticism, and it's the most insidious. And what it needs sometimes is for people to read a review and then go back and just read it again slowly to realise that the message at the end of that review is quite clearly, don't buy this book, and yet the person hasn't actually said it. I've no problem with people who express an opinion and say, I wouldn't ever buy a book from this author again, because that's their opinion, and readers can agree or disagree. But when people have the arrogance to say, I didn't like this book, you shouldn't like it either, then that's merely telling people what to do and what to think. Finally, this isn't about authors. This isn't about the fact that somebody might review my book and decide that it's something that they don't want to read. That's their opinion and they're welcome to it. But it's about readers. It's about what readers do. And unfortunately, in our society, readers take far more notice of reviews than they should, in my opinion. And let me just give you one example. This morning, for breakfast, I had Marmite on toast. I like Marmite. That's my opinion. But I know some people love Marmite and some people hate Marmite. It's a saying. Sometimes you see a book and you say, it's a Marmite thing. You might love it, you might loathe it. And that gives people the chance to have an opinion. I think that readers need to be more cautious and say to themselves, if somebody recommends me to have Marmite for breakfast, I have to make up my own mind about that, because it's not necessarily true that this person's taste is the same as my taste. I might like peppers on my pizza, other people don't, and we're quite happy about that when we're talking about food. Somebody might say, try the fish, it's absolutely lovely in this restaurant, and you might say, I'm not in a mood for fish today, and people will accept that. But with books, for some reason, if somebody says, this is a really exciting story, and it's about the times we live in, it's called Sanctioned, and it's about people being sanctioned and people being sectioned. It's political. You'll love it. You have to say as a reader, excuse me, I won't necessarily love it. I need to make up my own mind about that. You need, as a reader, to be clear that you have opinions, you have tastes, and reviews can only ever be a guide. They can tell you what the book's about, they can tell you whether that person loves it or not, but the idea that somebody else can then say to you, because I love it, you're going to love it. Because I bought it, you need to buy it. That just turns you into some kind of robot rather than a discerning reader. And if you want to help writers, then what you need to be is a reader that knows your own mind rather than simply following what some reviewer has told you and what some reviewer has told you to do.